Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Hilltop. Welcome to SMU and to Dedman College and to Dallas Hall, and in particular this evening to the Center for Presidential History. My name is Jeffrey Engel, and I have the honor of directing the center, which means, of course, I always also have the honor of being your master of ceremonies for this evening. This evening, we have another in our series of presidential history and memoirs, though this time with a slight twist, of course. And this is, of course, our series which is done in conjunction with the Bush Presidential Library as part of SMU's ongoing partnership with that wonderful institution. Before we get to the evening's events particular, you may notice that the screen behind me is not discussing Louisa Adams. Instead, we want to remind you of an event that we have coming up in early November, November 6th in particular, where we have a day-long exploration of the intersection of religion and politics. Religion and politics in our own contemporary America, in fact. Now, you may note that this is immediately following Election Day. And of course, as I mentioned at our last event, we thought it would be nice after Election Day to have a couple of topics that could in no way possibly offend anyone. So, religion and politics, there you go. And the evening, that'll be an all-day event. The evening, we're going to have a keynote from Senator John Danforth, whom you may recall was not only a long-serving member of the United States Senate, but also was President George W. Bush's ambassador to the United Nations. And what makes him particularly relevant in this context, aside from that long public service career, was also his experience that during the entire time he was an ordained minister. And he is currently writing a book which has the effective title of Religion and Politics in 21st Century America. So we think he'll have a lot to say on the subject from a lot of personal experience. So please, if you're interested in that, check out our website, smu.edu/cph. And of course, as with all of our events, we just ask you to register. There is, of course, no admission charge for any of these things, so please come along and enjoy the day. But right now, I'd like to turn to what I'm sure will be the opportunity to enjoy the evening in order to tell you about the event that we have for you tonight. This is part of our ongoing exploration, not only of the presidency and the history of the U.S. presidency, but also in particular, that deeply more important institution of the First Lady. We have been really impressed by the enthusiasm that we have for studying First Ladies, and I have to, in full disclosure, this is one of those wonderful opportunities where we get to learn from you. There is several times over the course of the last 2 years where people have come up and explained to me that we should spend more time thinking about the First Ladies, and I'll tell you, every time we do, I say to myself, we need to spend more time still. So I'm glad that we're having this opportunity, and tonight we have one in particular who I think you'll find particularly fascinating, and I'm not going to say anything about her lest I ruin the surprise. But let me tell you instead about our speaker this evening. There is no one more qualified than he to give our topic tonight. Jim Taylor is our speaker, who earned his doctorate in early American history from the University of Tennessee. And he then taught history, American history at that, at the University of South Carolina for more than 20 years, where he also served as director of the Papers of Henry Laurens. Now, Laurens, as I'm sure most of you know, succeeded John Hancock as the president of the Continental Congress. Upon completion of the 16th and final volume of that project in 2002, Jim then accepted the position of editor-in-chief of the Adams Papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. Now, let me tell you, this is a massive project, and a popular one at that. The Adams Papers project has a staff of 8 historians and editors and has published 48 volumes to date. And they produce now on average more than one a year, including, and this is quite critical, including extensive digital work and digitization of the entire Adams project. As a result, all of the documents published in the modern editions are available on the Massachusetts Historical Society website. And as a new history center, one that is developing not only our own legacy of research, but also our own digital legacy, let me tell you that we use them extensively as an intellectual model and guidestone. Now, in 2007, he co-edited My Dearest Friend, which is a selection of Abigail and John Adams' letters. And in 2013, he published a 2-volume scholarly edition of the diary and autobiographical writings of John Quincy Adams' wife, Louisa Catherine. But then in early 2014, he co-edited a somewhat briefer version, of that under the title A Traveled First Lady, And that is what we are fortunate enough tonight to learn more about. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Taylor.
The Adams family collected papers from, really, there's some papers that date back to the 1630s. They're deeds that they saved. But most of the papers date earliest from the 1750s, and they go right up almost until 1900. We have over 100,000 documents. Now, most of them are 1 or 2 pages, but some of the documents are extraordinary. For example, John Quincy Adams' diary. It's 15,000 pages long. Over the years, beginning in 1954 is a critical year because the Adams family, who had kept this archive closed to the public, transferred ownership to the Massachusetts Historical Society and said, publish it. And that's what we're doing. Well, over the years, the most famous of the Adamses, the people you recognize. You know the name John Adams, you know John Quincy Adams, and many of you know Abigail Adams. But these are only some of the Adamses. There are other ones that they're important to me, and I hope eventually will be important to you too. There's, I think, almost 3 tiers of Adamses. There's the Mount Rushmore type Adamses, John, Abigail, and John Quincy. And then there's other ones. Have you heard of Henry Adams, historian, writer, famous for his education of Henry Adams? Charles Francis Adams was a diplomat who ministered to England, very important during the period of the Civil War. So there's been other important Adamses, but they're not at the Abigail and John level. And then there's a bunch of other Adamses who I think are important. Their letters are really amazing. They contain a lot of good information, not only about the family, but about the history of the nation. Some of these people, once you get to know them, once their letters are published, I think move up in the importance of American history. Now, Louisa Catherine is somebody who's been terribly overlooked over the years. Even by the Adams family, most people kind of didn't pay that much attention to her, and I think tonight I might be able to explain at least some of the reason why. The Adams editors overlooked her. In 1970, 2 volumes of portraits. There's an awful lot of portraits of the Adamses. And there was one volume is entitled Portraits of John and Abigail Adams. The other volume is entitled Portraits of John Quincy Adams and his wife. Now, this was done by the Adams editors. She didn't have a name. She did have a name. She was Mrs. Adams. In 1974, the first editor of the Adams papers, a man named Lyman Butterfield, published an article. Every once in a while I'll refer to something. The article was entitled Tending a Dragon Killer. Notes for the biography of notes for the biographer of Mrs. John Quincy Adams. And he wrote, "She was bound to have been crowded from view by her husband. To those who study John Quincy Adams close up, he seems to have been more a natural force like Niagara Falls, more than a mere human being. Everything and everybody around him shrinks by comparison. In conflict with him, almost everybody sooner or later either shriveled up or slunk away. What then must it have been like to live with him? His wife lived with him for over 50 years. Thus, if there was nothing else remarkable about her, we surely should give her credit for the amazing powers of survival." Another reason I think that Louisa Catherine has been overlooked was that she was in the shadow of Abigail. Abigail Adams has had numerous biographies written about her. She was a forceful, influential, and an important American. Louisa was afraid of her. Perhaps like no daughter-in-law was afraid of another mother-in-law. One of the things that I think is ironic is that Louisa, over time, wrote memoirs. She wrote these in little snippets, like little chapters. In one of the chapters, she entitled The Adventures of a Nobody. And I think that's telling. That's what she, within the Adams clan, much of the time she felt, even as a elderly person, that somehow she didn't measure up. I think you'll find that possibly she did. There have been almost no studies of Louisa until recently, and all of a sudden, there seems to be a deluge of interest in new studies. The first one, the most famous event in her life, other than marrying into the Adams family, of course, was what she called her adventure. And I'll tell you more about it later. She went on her own, 2 servants and an 8-year-old child, from St. Petersburg, Russia, to Paris. And about 4 or 5 years ago, a scholar in England, a man named Michael O'Brien, wrote a book entitled Mrs. Adams in Winter, because it was a winter journey that she took. And then all of a sudden, more and more interest came out. A woman named Marjorie Heffron wrote a biography. Evan Thomas's daughter, Evan Thomas, the journalist's daughter, Louisa Thomas, who's an accomplished historian on her own, is in the midst of writing a biography, a cradle to grave, on Louisa Catherine. Another woman, Phyllis Levin, has just completed a manuscript on, and also this is, thinking about Phyllis Levin, her book is ostensibly a biography of John Quincy Adams. Of John Quincy Adams. It's called The Education of John Quincy Adams. I think she's taken it from the Henry Adams education. But I read the manuscript, and it's almost as much about Louisa Catherine. She's come out of the shadows now, so the importance and the influence of Louisa is seen. And there are other works underway on her. So all of a sudden, she's become interesting. So who was Louisa? First of all, and the one distinction that she has is that she's the only foreign-born American First Lady. She was born in London in 1775. But she was born to an American father, a man from Maryland. His name was Joshua Johnson. He was a successful merchant. They lived on Tower Hill in London. They had a fine home. She had 8 sisters and 1 brother. All of the children lived to adulthood. The family was wealthy enough to have portraits made. These are pastels. The people on the top, that's Joshua. That's Louisa's mother on the right. Her name was Catherine Nuth Johnson. And that's Louisa, age about, 17. There were also, actually, I realized when I read the caption, this is wrong. It's only 5 because that's Louisa again in the middle. These pastels are at the Historical Society. She tells a lot in her diary and autobiographical writings about her parents. And I'll explain more about that later. As I said, they were well off. They had a wonderful home. And one of the things about the Johnsons was that they were proud to be Americans. Unfortunately, shortly after she's born, the American Revolution breaks out, and they have to move, or they do move, to France. So as a young child, from the age of about 3 to 9, she lives in France. She goes to convent school. So about the time she's learned to speak English by the time she's 3 years old, but from the time she's 3 until almost 9, she goes to a French school. Now, this sets what I think is an important trajectory in her life. She's an outsider. She had a difficult time, she says in her autobiographical writings, adjusting to being in France, being a little English girl in France and learning French. Plus the fact she went to a Catholic school and they were Protestants. So the war is over, they go back to England, so she goes to boarding school and she doesn't speak very good English. So she's an outsider again. And she says about her experience that this caused her to be standoffish. She didn't like society. She didn't like the idea of mixing with other people because the other girls made fun of her. So she developed, I guess, what in modern times we would call an attitude. She said that her classmates referred to her as Miss Proud. But this was, I guess, what we would say kind of a defense that she threw up. As time goes by, she gets acclimated. She says at school the things, she didn't like the regular academic subjects. What she liked was theater, music, dance, this sort of thing. She was a performer. This would serve her well later. As I said there, her father was an American. He was from Maryland. He was very proud of being an American. She tells stories about his patriotism. For example, one time she said she was in his office and this strange man came in and he served as the American consul in London. So he had an official American dealing with merchants for the most part and passports, this sort of thing. Anyway, she said she was in the office one time and a man came in. She said a strange man came in and father was doing business with him. And when the man left, her father went to the fireplace, picked up the fireplace tongs, picked up the pen that the man had used and took it over and dropped it in the fireplace. The man was Benedict Arnold. These were the kind of stories she told to show her father's patriotism. Part of this, I think, because she's telling these stories much later, and she writes these stories, these memoirs, for her children. And I think part of this is to kind of balance the stupendous Adams legacy. She's saying, I came from important people too. I came from patriots too. Her father, as I said, kept almost like an open house for Americans. So it was a meeting place for young students, for diplomats, for ship captains. She met a lot of she said that she knew John Paul Jones when she was young, and a lot of other people. In 1794, John Quincy Adams was sent to the Netherlands on a diplomatic assignment by President Washington. In 1795, he had to go to London on some other business. He had an assignment to go to London. Well, where did young Americans go to congregate, to meet other Americans, to be entertained? They went to the Johnson House, where Joshua and Catherine Nuth Johnson entertained them. It was a place for them to relax, to be with other Americans. And of course, there were 8 daughters. No, she was the second oldest, so some of these daughters were, 4 or 5 years old. In November of 1795, John Trumbull, have any of you heard of the artist John Trumbull? He's the artist of the American Revolution. He introduced John Quincy Adams to the Johnsons, took him along. John Quincy kept coming back and coming back and coming back. And one of the things is the young ladies, used to entertain. They'd sing, they'd dance, they'd play the piano. Louisa's specialty was the harp. And they would sing and entertain people. John Quincy kept coming back. And actually the daughters made fun of him because they didn't like the way he dressed. He dressed, as they said, Dutch, which meant very light-colored clothing. And he just wasn't in style in London. But they liked him, and the father, he didn't like Yankees too much, but he realized that John Quincy Adams was an up-and-comer. Everybody thought that he was there and was going to start courting Nancy, the older sister. Louisa said she didn't pay any attention to him. And then there was some embarrassing evening where he blurted something out about how much he liked her and whatever. But anyway, so after a while, they're engaged. Here's a problem. And this has got nothing to do with Louisa, it has to do with the Adamses. Abigail Adams had broken up one of John Quincy Adams's romances. Indirectly. She was, you're probably not ready, you don't have enough money, you need to be a little more mature, etc. I think one of the reasons that John Quincy Adams eventually got married in England was because he was away from his mother, domineering mother. Maybe not. So they courted. They were engaged in 1796. The problem with the engagement was that John Quincy Adams had to go back to the Netherlands for his diplomatic post. And they carried on a correspondence, and we have the letters, these courtship letters. They're terrible. He browbeat her, told her what to read, and he talked down to her. One of the problems she had is, and this is one of the things I like about Louisa, is that she grows. She's like a character, and a good character in a novel. She develops, she grows, she gains confidence. As a matter of fact, her very first letter, she admitted later, she didn't write herself. Her governess helped her write them because she was afraid that her vocabulary was not good enough for somebody like John Quincy Adams. So as time went by, she kind of got her feet underneath her, got her own voice. She was more assertive. John Quincy Adams kept putting marriage off. The reason, he said, was, we don't have enough money, my career is not secure, I don't know what's going to happen. And then things started to move along more quickly. He received a new appointment. He was going to be the U.S. minister to Portugal. So he was just waiting in the Netherlands for his replacement to come, and then he was going to go to Portugal. And he said, but you can't go to Portugal. War's going to break out, and you're a fine lady, and you're going to be corrupted by everything that goes on. And on. She said, well, my father will supply the ship. So he thought that over. The man came to replace him, and he came to London. They were married in July of 1797. Now, in the midst of this, Louisa's world is about to blow up. Her terribly secure life, her wonderful parents are now going back to America. So this is shocking for her. She's lived in this household all her life. She loved these people. They provided security, and she revered them. So shortly after they're married, that's shortly after Louisa and John Quincy are married, parents leave for America. In the meantime, about this time, John Adams is elected president. He takes office in 1797. What we don't know, or what Louisa didn't know, is that her father was bankrupt and creditors were closing in on him. So this secure life that she had had, her father had promised her what we call a dowry, 5,000 pounds, huge amount. This is one of the things that was going to make their life secure to start off. This was the seed money to get them going. Not a nickel, or not a pence, or a shilling, or whatever. Nothing. As a matter of fact, right after they left, creditors started hitting on John Quincy Adams' door asking for money to pay off the debts. This was humiliating for Louisa Catherine. As a matter of fact, she said that people now said that she had been palmed off on the Adamses. Her father needed somebody to take care of her. And this had all been, he knew all along that he was in debt and he had to unload daughters. And this is what happened. I think that much of what she wrote for her children in defense of her father, great patriot, wonderful father, was a way of covering this up. I've always been sympathetic to Louisa, and that maybe he didn't know what was happening, that it was a corrupt partner or bad investments or a ship had gone astray. There were all kinds of arguments that were used to why this had gone bad. But I read a manuscript that somebody has submitted recently on, and they said, no, he was a crook. Not a crook, but he knew what was happening. He was not fully honest with John Quincy Adams. So Louisa, within weeks of being married, feels as though she's a loser. Once again, she's the outsider. She doesn't fit. Now, think of the balance here. John Quincy Adams, his father just became president. Her father, debtor. So this all goes into getting to understand Louisa, I think. Now, another shock happens. John Adams decides his son's not going to Portugal. That's not an important enough place. He's going to Berlin. He's going to be the U.S. minister to Prussia. So within about 2 months of their marriage, they're off to Berlin. Shocking. Here, she's 22 years old. She'd never been away from England. She'd barely been away from London. She's in Berlin. She has no friends. Oh, yeah, and she's pregnant. This brings up one of the most important things in understanding Louisa. At that time, people did not, at least they didn't record information. You will very seldom see the word pregnant or miscarriage or anything about these situations in the writings of the time. You have to ferret, you have to understand the language, the code words. The women on our project, having read through her papers and through John Quincy Adams, believe she, during her lifetime, had 11 miscarriages. 1 stillbirth. Much of her life, she was ill one way or another. Also, she had long periods of depression. So she comes to Berlin. They come to Berlin. It's difficult for her. She's ill. But she begins to bloom socially. This is where, even as early as the age of 22 or 23, she's an important balance. She helps John Quincy Adams in many ways. In one of the ways, John Quincy Adams was the sourest man socially that you can imagine. He was, as we say in South Carolina, maybe you say it in Texas too, serious as a heart attack. One diplomat in Russia referred to him, and looking at the other diplomats, said he was like a bulldog among spaniels. She wasn't. When she wasn't down being ill or depressed, she was a great dancer, she was a great conversationalist, and the one thing that survives from her days at the convent school, she was fluent in French. And at that time, French was the diplomatic language in Europe. So she could go to the functions. She could serve. Very quickly, she became popular at court. She danced with Frederick William III. She became a friend of Queen Louise of Prussia. This is one of the things that the title of this book that we edited recently is A Traveled First Lady. Later in her life, she said, one of the great taxes that I have to pay is to hide the fact that I am a well-traveled lady. What it meant was, when she came back to America, she was pretty sophisticated. And there were other stops along the way. Eventually she had danced with Alexander I. She had danced with Frederick William III. She knew much of the nobility in Russia and Prussia and England. She was important in John Quincy Adams' diplomatic life. Their first child was born in 1801 in Berlin. And his name was George Washington Adams. That's a problem. And she didn't find out until she came back to America and she found out that Abigail was not pleased with that choice. It should have been John Adams, Jr. Anyway, they came back to America in 1801. His father recalled him after he lost the election to Thomas Jefferson. So he thought it was the best thing to do not to leave it to Jefferson, called his son home. So the Adamses went back to, well, she didn't go back to because she'd never been to America. They landed in Philadelphia. She went south to see her parents who were living outside of Washington, D.C., all but destitute. As a matter of fact, John Adams got her father a job in the government, patronage job. But her father was ill and dying at that time. So don't forget my pictures to show you what they look like. This is about what they looked like when they were courting. This is Louisa a little before they met, and the picture of John by John Singleton Copley. Looks like a romance novel hero, doesn't he? He had that done for his mother. I don't think he ever looked that good, to tell you the truth. He was quickly balding by that time, and somehow they, I don't know, blew dry his hair or something. But anyway, they come back to America. She goes to see her parents. he goes up to New England. And then later he comes down, meets her, and takes her up. And when she came to Quincy, that's where the Adamses live, she wrote, "It was as if I was stepping onto Noah's Ark." It was the strangest place she had said she'd ever been. Now, remember, she had been in London, she'd been in Berlin, she had danced with royalty, she was a favorite at court. She goes to this little New England town, little Congregationalist town. I wouldn't say the people were narrow-minded, but she just didn't fit in. And also, Abigail was a strong woman in more than one way. She ran the Adams farms for many years when John was away. Louisa felt helpless. She was a city girl from London. She felt inadequate. Now, they stayed in Massachusetts. They lived in Boston part of the time, and sometimes they lived out in Quincy. John Quincy Adams quickly became involved in local politics. He was elected to the state legislature. He had a chair at Harvard. The man was constantly active. One of the things that happened very soon was he was elected to the Senate from Massachusetts. So now they go off to Washington. In Washington, he's very independent. He doesn't always, he's elected by a Federalist legislature. He goes his own way. Sometimes he supports Jefferson. So they decide not to re-elect him, and he knows that. They've already selected somebody else, so he resigns. Comes back, he's going to practice law. He does practice law. Louisa's pretty happy. They have their own home. They're settled down. They have 2 more children. Second children, guess what his second son, guess what his name was? John Adams. They got the hint. The third son, John Adams, the second, was born in 1803. The third son was born in 1807, Charles Francis Adams. In 1809, John Quincy Adams went to Washington to work on a court case before the Supreme Court. And while he was there, new President Madison took him inside and said, "I've got a job for you. How would you like to be the first minister, U.S. minister to Russia?" He said, "Great, I'll take the job." Now, he hadn't consulted Louisa. She was shocked when she found out. She was even more upset when she found out that John Quincy and his mother decided that the 2 older boys would not go with them. They'd stay in New England. So when Louisa Catherine and John Quincy sailed with their infant son, the 2 young boys stayed with their grandmother. Louisa didn't see them for almost 6 years. This, she said later, was one of the things that she most regretted in her life. Also, interestingly, the person in the family, other than John Quincy, that she liked the most was the old man, John Adams. And they said just before they left, they wouldn't let her see John Adams because he would be sympathetic. And if he said the boys go, then the boys would go. So they wouldn't let her talk to John Adams. So she goes off to Russia with John Quincy Adams, devastated. They get to St. Petersburg the beginning of the winter. Not a pleasant place to be in the winter. She becomes, once again, one of the favorites at court. She's friendly with, particularly with Alexander I. Unfortunately, her younger sister came along, and Alexander I, let me think of a nice word, had a crush on her sister. One of the problems was Alexander I got what he wanted most of the time. So for a few months, Louisa spent much of her time keeping her sister away, or keeping Alexander I away from her sister. Time goes by. They have another child, a daughter, in 1812, named Louisa Catherine. Louisa thought she was blessed. The child died, age 13 months, dysentery. Louisa was devastated. One of the low points in her life. In her writing years and years later, she reflects on that time and says the only thing she wanted at that time was to be buried with her daughter. Terrible depression. So what does John Quincy Adams do? He goes to Ghent to take care of a treaty to end the War of 1812. He leaves her for a year in Russia with little Charles Francis, who's about 7 or 8 years old. Then the treaty is signed, so he sends a message to her. I'll meet you in Paris. So in February of 1815, she packs up a few things that she wants to take with her. She gets a Russian carriage, one that you can shift to be a sled or a carriage. She takes off with 2 servants and her son. And it took them 40 days to go cross-country 2,000 miles from St. Petersburg to Paris. She had 4 passports. This is the one that she got. We have the original in Berlin. She had to get a new French passport. The reason why, she had a French passport from the French minister to the court of St. Petersburg. The reason she had to get a new passport is that Napoleon had come back from Elba. This is the period known as the 100 Days, where Napoleon comes back. So she's not only crossing 2,000 miles, it's wartime. The soldiers, the French soldiers, are reassembling. Thank God she knew French. Saved her again. The rumor was that she was Napoleon's sister. She didn't deny it. She didn't deny it. Anyway, she goes this 40-day journey. And then many years later, she writes an account of it. This is the first page, narrative of a journey. She said she wrote it for her children, but also to inspire young women that you can do what you don't think you can do. So she rejoins her husband. As a matter of fact, she was at their apartment before he got there. He was at the theater that night. Came home to find them. They're only there for a little while, and he is appointed now by, which president is it? That's Madison still. Minister, U.S. Minister to Great Britain. So off they go to London. She refers to this in her writings as the happiest time of her life. These are portraits of them. You can see John's aged a little bit, as you may have noticed. This is portraits for the period that they're in London. They're only there for 2 years because when James Monroe is elected president, he recalls John Quincy Adams to make him Secretary of State, position that he will hold from 1817 to 1825. This is the period where Louisa really shines. She becomes the belle of the ball. She's the great entertainer in Washington. One of the reasons is, even though she doesn't really assert herself all the time, she's a well-traveled lady. She's been to London, to St. Petersburg, to Berlin, She knows what high society is. And also added to this, Mrs. Monroe was ill much of the time, so there wasn't as much entertaining done at the White House. So the Adamses entertained. And what was important about this, they gave dinners, and she had a regular once-a-week thing that she called her Tuesday Sociable, which was the event. You needed to be invited to Louisa's sociables. Dancing, music, food, wine. Now, early on, certainly by 1820, John Quincy Adams was a rising star on the political scene. And one of the reasons that he was as popular as he was, if John Quincy Adams was ever popular, was because of his wife. She played an important role. He just didn't have those social skills. From 1819 to 1824, she kept a diary. And actually what the diary was, it served two purposes. She copied out her diary as letters to John Adams, old John Adams, to keep him abreast of what was going on. She talked about the politics in the period, all the gossip in Washington. It's a wonderful read. Really wonderful read. She knew everybody. The highest point. This is a portrait by Gilbert Stuart. She hated this portrait, by the way. She gave it to one of her sons. I think it's at the White House now. She said it made it look cross-eyed or something. I don't know if it did or not. Anyway, also she hated, Gilbert Stuart was one of the great portrait painters of the time. She despised him. She said his manners were so bad, and he smoked tobacco. And anyway, she said he was a lousy example if you're going to show your children what a gentleman should be. Anyway, we say circa 1821. It took him 5 years to finish the painting. So I'm not really sure. It probably was finished about 1825, but it was started in 1821. All right, this is the event. I was going to say the event of the century. It was probably the event of the decade. Politically, she knew that they had to find a way to get Andrew Jackson, or believed they needed to get Andrew Jackson in the Adams camp. So they threw a huge party, a ball, for Andrew Jackson on the anniversary of his victory at New Orleans. Probably as many as 1,000 people came to their house. They knew it was going to be big. They even put up new braces on the floor because they knew that people would be upstairs and downstairs, and they decorated for weeks. Jackson didn't support, I don't know if you know, Jackson didn't support John Quincy Adams. But even as late as 1871, there was a story about it in Harper's Bazaar. But she was, some of you are old enough to remember, the name Pearl Mesta? She was a great entertainer in Washington. Louisa was a Pearl Mesta of that era, only more so. Adams is elected. Controversial election that I won't go into. Her time in the White House, 1825 to 1829, was another one of those low points. She spent much of her time in her room. She was ill frequently. She picked herself up later in the administration. She still was entertaining. One of the reasons she picked herself up and got back into it was there was another campaign coming up. And she was active again, trying to convince those movers and shakers by coming to their house, coming to the White House, having parties. She continued to be a great entertainer. But, as you know, Jackson swept Adams out of office. She leaves no diary for this period. There's no memoir. We do have letters, though, and her letters are full of complaint. One of the things is she referred to the White House as a half-finished barn. Needed decorated. She said, "Did you know how Mrs. Monroe could live in a place like that?" She said, "The windows rattled so bad it gave her a headache." This may have just been the complaining Louisa. I'm not sure. Anyway, tragedy strikes. John Quincy Adams sent for George Washington Adams, who was in Boston, to come down and help them pack up and move some of their belongings. They're going to maintain some things in Washington, but for the most part, they were going to move back to Quincy, Boston. On the way down, he either fell or jumped from a boat and was drowned. What we found out subsequently is that he had fathered an illegitimate child with one of the servants in the apartment building that he was in. So he was humiliated. Also, he was an alcoholic. Devastating for Louisa, firstborn. George somehow was an artistic person. He never lived up to it. His father wanted him to be a lawyer and a politician. He just never made it. Later that year, and this is one of those things, it's like something out of Edgar Allan Poe, I think. Later that year, Charles Francis was going to get married that summer, so he sent for his mother and I think a cousin who were living in Washington to come up to Boston for the wedding. And he would come down and meet them in New York and then come the rest of the way. So he met them in New York and told his mother, "Yes, we'll be sailing on the Benjamin Franklin," was the name of the boat. The boat that her other son had jumped or fallen from. When she heard that, she collapsed, incapacitated, couldn't go on, couldn't go to the wedding. But it was one of those terrible, terrible events. So they go back. Eventually he gets back to Boston. She thinks things are going to settle down. John Quincy Adams couldn't stay away from public life. As I know most of you are aware, he went back and served in Congress. He was only away from Washington for about 18 months, and he stayed in Congress until his death. He died in the Capitol building. How appropriate. In 1848. Her later years, she still entertained a little bit, but she was much quieter, much subdued in later life, turned more to religion. You see in her writings many prayers and religious poems. Not too much later, I think it was 1834, John Adams II died. Failure, alcoholic. Now, as she thinks back, the son that's the success, the man who goes on to be a great diplomat, was the child that she kept close to her. The boys that she had left behind failed. She blamed herself. Supposedly, as years went by, she thought she possibly could have done something. I think if you went back to 1809 and that situation in Quincy with Abigail and John Quincy saying the boys are going to stay, she really didn't have a choice. But she blamed herself, and this was a burden she carried with her. She had a stroke in 1849, and for the most part was incapacitated after that. Her daughter-in-law, the John Adams II's wife, took care of her in those remaining years. On New Year's Day, because she was this, iconic figure in Washington at that time. On New Year's Day, President Fillmore came to see her. Other dignitaries came to pay their respects to her. She died in May 1853. Congress adjourned for her funeral. First time that had happened for a First Lady. She's buried in Quincy, Congregationalist church, that there's a crypt in the basement. John Adams, Abigail Adams, John Quincy Adams, Louisa Catherine Adams. It's a touching place to go to. She's remembered. Let me finish off. Henry Adams, the great historian, her grandson. If I can remember, if I can find what I have. "55 years after her death, he recalled, 'The madam was a little more remote than the president.'" Now remember, he was 14 years old when she died. So he knew her. He was a little boy when he knew her. "The madam was a little more remote than the president, but more decorative. She stayed much in her own room with the Dutch tiles, looking out on her garden with the boxwood walks, and seemed a fragile creature to a boy who sometimes brought her a note or a message and took distinct pleasure in looking at her delicate face under what seemed to him very becoming caps. He liked her refined figure, her gentle voice and manner, her vague effect of not belonging there, but to Washington or Europe, like her furniture and writing desk with little glass doors above and little 18th century volumes in old bindings. Try as she might, that madam could never be a Bostonian. And it was her cross in life, but to the boy, it was her charm." Thank you. That's the writing desk that he referred to.
Well, we have the opportunity for some questions. Now, we are, as always, videotaping this, so if you wouldn't mind, when you're asking a question, please wait for the microphone so we can be sure to record your voice for posterity. So who wants to be posthumous? Please.
Hi. Whenever you had the portrait of them courting, Louisa, she has a black satin band around her wrist. Was she in mourning or something?
I don't think so. I've seen a description of that portrait, but I have never heard that. It's possible, but I don't know. If she would have been mourning, it would have been more obvious. That's kind of like what baseball players do now, isn't that right? Or a football player.
Did she keep up any kind of correspondence with her friends in Europe?
Not that I'm aware of. A lot with her sisters, and they all came to America when the family came over. As a matter of fact, John Quincy and Louisa kind of propped some of them up. Her sister, the one that Alexander I was interested in, married John Quincy Adams' nephew, he was a dud. He was in debtor's prison, and they took care of the family. He got jobs for some of the other husbands, and etc. One of the sisters married a congressman, but I don't know that they corresponded. Now, when she went on that dash across Europe, she did stop in Berlin and see some of her old friends. She spent a few days in Berlin to see some of her old friends.
It seems like when Henry Adams describes Louisa Catherine, that she's kind of a figure of that older, like early Republican generation that's passing away. You know, you have the death of John Adams and the death of Thomas Jefferson, and there's kind of this controversy over whether America was founded with this trajectory towards absolute democracy that Jackson brings in during the period of Jacksonian democracy, or whether that's not what the founders had in mind. They had in mind a more sort of stable society. Does Louisa Catherine herself, in any of her letters to John Adams, express any political opinions, or is it mostly just social conversation?
A couple of things. No, she talks a lot about politics, and one of the things during this time is the Missouri Compromise. And she goes to some of the debates in the legislature about that. Now, one of the things you have to understand about Louisa is she's torn. She's married to a New Englander. She's from Maryland. Her uncle was the first governor of post-British Maryland, so they were prominent. The family was prominent. Plus the fact some of the family members owned slaves. She's not a supporter of slavery, but she has what we call it, sympathies for some of the positions. So she's really torn on a lot of these events. Now, one of the things is that John Quincy Adams used her. John Quincy Adams was always so busy he couldn't write to his father. So she was the kind of conduit of information back to the old man. And one of the times in one of the newspapers in New England, John Adams said something about the Missouri Compromise. John Quincy told Louisa, tell him not to say anything anymore. The reason being, he had to walk, slavery at this time was the third rail in American politics. So he had aspirations. He was opposed to slavery. He was absolutely opposed to slavery, but you didn't make overt statements about it if you were trying to be elected. So he used her to kind of send a message to her father. Now, as far as democracy, we're going from the Adamses were always referred to by the opposition as monarchists. And one of the things that in the election campaign of 1828, the Jacksonians went after John Quincy Adams, and they drug up old stuff, absolutely screwed up, about his time in Russia. They referred to him as the pimp of St. Petersburg. Okay, here's the real story. Their maid, one of their maids, a woman named Martha Godfrey, used to write home to New England. She was a good New England lady, complaining about St. Petersburg and about the royal family. What she didn't realize is that all the mail was opened. So Alexander I said to John Quincy Adams, I'd like to speak to your maid. So he sent her. But the rumor then was that he had ideas about Mrs. Godfrey, which was absolutely crazy. But in order in the campaign of 1828, one of the problems that John Quincy Adams had is that he was so severe, he wouldn't stoop to conquer. He was a man, he didn't chase votes, he didn't run for election, he stood for election. This is who I am. Louisa was a little more politic about some of these things. So there's a report, an Englishman wrote a report, appeared in an English newspaper, about traveling in New England on some public conveyance. It was a boat, I don't know where it was going. And Mrs. Adams was there, and she was mixing it with the people and being friendly and stuff. She was politicking. She was out pressing the flesh or whatever. And one of the things he noted, and this is so much different than we know now, he said that half of the people didn't recognize her, didn't know who she was until she was introduced. Can you imagine a first lady not being recognized? That's the difference between media now and then. Anyway.
It seems in listening to your talk, I've got two comments. First, I see a lot of genetics between the Adams families, a lot of the genetics that run through family traits in the offspring that kind of weave through. And it's interesting to me that since John Quincy, the first president's son, had accompanied him when he went to Europe the first time, against his mother's will, really. Or I guess it wasn't against his mother's
She
will.
questioned it, but she realized,
Yeah. But then she didn't let the 2 children of her son go with him to Russia. She was a strong woman, truly.
one of the ways you can describe it.
Abigail,
yes.
yeah. And the second thing that's interesting to me is the White House seems to have been a very bad atmosphere for the women first ladies.
You mean illness?
They were ill a lot. When did they wait till after Jackson sort of tore up the White House before they decided they were going to make it habitable for women?
I don't know that much about the White House history.
It's kind of interesting.
But you're saying about Abigail. When John Quincy Adams was a boy, about 11 or 12 years old, he went to Europe with his father. When he left, his mother wrote him a little letter. And in that letter, she told John Quincy, you have to be on your honor and represent the family, and with all these platitudes. I would rather see you sink to the bottom of the sea than dishonor your family. That's tough stuff for an 11-year-old kid, isn't it? But that's Abigail. She was a tough cookie. She was a tough cookie.
What their lifestyle was in 1812 with Napoleon approaching and the Americans' positions in that America did have affiliations with the French prior to all of this. And I mean, that had to have been a very difficult thing to walk, to say, where did they even go as he approached?
Well, she left in February of 1815. You're talking about her trip across. Oh, earlier than that. Oh, right. Well, he didn't get to St. Peter. They were in St. Petersburg, so he didn't get to St. Petersburg. As a matter of fact, Alexander and most of his generals went down to Mesta was down closer to Moscow. So they were not in danger. The only time that she felt that she was in danger was when she made that trek and he was coming back. And part of it was not Napoleon himself, but the enthusiasm of the troops, plus the fact they were traveling in a easily identifiable Russian carriage. That was the problem, and that's where her French came in, and rumors about her being Napoleon's sister.
Well, this has been wonderful, and I encourage you to go out and get your own copy. We have a place where you can buy them, a table right outside, so you can all go home, enjoy this, and learn more about a well-traveled First Lady. And if you wouldn't mind joining me in thanking our speaker for the evening.